It was on a bright afternoon in early spring that Captain Arthur Hastings found himself seated in the smoking carriage of the 3:40 train to Kent, a copy of the Times folded neatly upon his knee. Across from him, Hercule Poirot sat with perfect composure, immaculate as ever, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his waxed mustaches symmetrical to the last hair. "My dear Hastings," he remarked, "observe how the English countryside emerges from the winter like a young girl blushing beneath her first compliment. The green is delicate, the word is tender." Hastings smiled at his friend's lyrical observation. They had been invited by Lady Amelia Highbury to spend the weekend at her estate, ostensibly for a house party and a viewing of the famed sapphire necklace. Hastings, who had served with Lady Amelia's late husband, was pleased at the thought of familiar faces and lively company. Poirot, however, had accepted for another reason entirely. A faint note of concern had been present in Lady Amelia's letter, though couched in the politest of phrases. When they arrived at Highbury Hall, the great house stood warm and golden in the late afternoon sun. Lady Amelia, a handsome woman of about 50 with a gracious manner, greeted them at the door. Her daughter, the strikingly beautiful Miss Celia Highbury, hovered nearby, a vision in pale blue, though her smile seemed just a touch too bright, as though concealing a worry. Within the drawing-room they were introduced to the rest of the party. Colonel Fitzroy, a bluff retired soldier with a booming voice; Mrs. Linton, a widowed neighbor who appeared to know everyone's business; and a young man named Gerald Fielding, whose sharp eyes and easy charm spoke of a different class than the Highburys, though he moved with confidence. After tea, Lady Amelia led them to the small, oak-paneled room where the necklace was kept until the exhibition. It rested in a velvet case, glittering richly beneath the lamplight. Poirot bent over it with a curious expression, noting the strong clasp and the quality of the workmanship. "Exquisite," he murmured, "and soon to be admired by many." "Yes," Lady Amelia replied, her hands clasping tightly. "We are lending it to the London Museum for a special display next week. It seemed only right to let our friends here see it one last time." As the guests departed for dressing before dinner, Hastings could not shake a faint feeling of unease. The necklace gleamed in his mind like a beacon, and perhaps, he thought, a temptation. Dinner that evening at Highbury Hall was as fine an affair as Hastings had ever known. The dining-room was a long, gracious chamber, its oak paneling glinting warmly in the candlelight. A fire crackled in the hearth, though the air outside was mild, adding to the atmosphere of comfort and luxury. The table gleamed with silver and crystal, and the conversation, at first, was light and musical. Poirot, seated to the right of Lady Amelia, observed everything with his usual quiet intensity. He noted the subtle glances exchanged between the younger guests, the way Miss Celia's laughter rang a trifle too loudly at Gerald Fielding's witticisms, and the fact that Colonel Fitzroy drank more claret than was strictly necessary. Hastings, meanwhile, found himself beside Mrs. Linton, who spoke in a confidential undertone of the latest village gossip. "I tell you, Captain Hastings," she said, fanning herself lightly with her napkin, "there is something odd about Mr. Fielding. Clever, yes, and rather good-looking, but no one quite knows where he sprang from. Some say he's a financier from the city, others insist he is merely a charming adventurer." "An adventurer," Hastings repeated, amused. "Well, a gentleman of fortune, shall we say," she replied with a twinkle in her eye. "And one must not forget, Celia has a considerable dowry. You know what young men are." At the other end of the table, the conversation had turned to the forthcoming exhibition in London. Lady Amelia spoke of her pride in contributing to it, though there was a faint tremor in her voice that did not escape Poirot's notice. "It is not merely an object of beauty," she said softly. "It is a family treasure. My husband's grandfather brought it from Russia under circumstances that were, well, rather dramatic." "Ah," Poirot murmured, leaning forward. "You must tell us, madame, the history of this splendid piece." Lady Amelia hesitated, then smiled. It was during the last days of the Tsar. The Grand Duchess Irina was a distant cousin, and she entrusted the necklace to the Highbury family for safekeeping as she fled the country. She never returned. It has been in our possession ever since. There was a moment's silence. The fire popped in the grate, and the wind outside moaned faintly in the chimneys. Colonel Fitzroy broke the spell with a hearty laugh. "Dash it all, Amelia, you make it sound like something out of a spy novel. Well, you'd best keep a close watch on it until it reaches the museum. These things have a habit of disappearing, you know." Hastings thought he saw Lady Amelia pale slightly. Poirot's eyes flickered, keen and bright. After dinner, they moved to the drawing-room for coffee and brandy. The women gathered near the fire, their silk gowns rustling, while the men stood in small knots discussing politics and horse racing. Poirot, who disliked standing for long periods, took a small chair near the center table and observed the room with satisfaction. It was then that Celia Highbury brought out the necklace once more at her mother's request, so that the gentleman might admire it. The case was passed from hand to hand, each guest exclaiming over its beauty. Gerald Fielding held it longest, turning the sapphires so that they caught the lamplight. "Exquisite," he said softly. "One could almost believe there is some magic in them. I can see why the Grand Duchess risked so much to save them." Mrs. Linton, watching him with a cat-like smile, remarked, "I only hope they are as safe here as they were in Russia. The world is full of clever thieves." "Indeed, madame," Poirot interjected gravely, "but also full of those who think themselves cleverer than they are." Celia laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. She placed the necklace back in its case, locking it with a small silver key that she slipped into her reticule. "It shall be placed back in the cabinet at once," she declared. "Mamma will not rest easy until it is under lock and key again." Hastings accompanied her as far as the corridor, where a footman waited with a lamp to escort her to the cabinet room. When she returned, her face looked a trifle paler, and she glanced quickly at Gerald Fielding, who smiled reassuringly. As the evening drew to a close, Lady Amelia urged her guests to retire early. "Tomorrow we have a long day ahead of us," she said with a gracious smile. "Breakfast will be at 8:30 sharp, and we must be ready for the photographer at 10. The exhibition committee insists on a formal portrait of the necklace before it departs for London." Upstairs, Hastings found himself lying awake longer than usual. There was something in the atmosphere of the house, a subtle tension, as though each guest was playing a role on some unseen stage. From the room next to his, he heard Poirot moving softly about, and then the creak of his bed as he settled. "Curious business," Hastings muttered to himself, "but no doubt I am imagining things." Downstairs, in the darkness of the cabinet room, the necklace lay gleaming in its velvet case. The moonlight slanted through the high windows, making the sapphires glimmer faintly like eyes in the night. Somewhere in the house, a door closed softly and a floorboard creaked. The next morning dawned gray and misty, the kind of spring morning when the air feels heavy with rain that never quite falls. Hastings, who prided himself on his punctuality, was already downstairs by the time the grandfather clock in the hall struck 8. The breakfast room smelled pleasantly of coffee and toast, but the house itself seemed unusually quiet, as though its occupants were reluctant to face the day. Lady Amelia appeared shortly after, her smile gracious but a little strained. Celia followed, pale but determined, her hair shining like spun gold despite the mist outside. One by one, the other guests trickled in, Colonel Fitzroy humming a marching tune under his breath, Mrs. Linton brisk and watchful, and Gerald Fielding with his easy charm firmly in place. Poirot entered last, faultlessly dressed, his mustaches quivering slightly as he surveyed the room. He took his seat, delicately buttered a slice of toast, and looked at Lady Amelia with polite interest. "Tell me, madame," he said softly, "did you sleep well last night?" Lady Amelia hesitated just a fraction of a second before replying. "As well as one ever does when one is the custodian of something so valuable," she said. "I confess I rose once in the night to satisfy myself that all was well." "And was it?" Poirot asked gently. "Yes," she replied quickly. "Of course. The case was locked and the key was where Celia had left it." Hastings noticed that Celia's spoon rattled faintly against her coffee cup. Breakfast passed without incident, though the conversation was more subdued than the night before. The talk centered on the impending arrival of the photographer and the preparations for the portrait. Colonel Fitzroy complained good-naturedly about the necessity of wearing his best jacket so early in the morning, and Mrs. Linton, ever sharp-eyed, remarked that the museum would doubtless appreciate a photograph showing the necklace worn by its rightful heiress. When the meal was concluded, the party dispersed to make themselves presentable. Hastings accompanied Poirot on a stroll through the garden, where the grass was wet with dew and the early tulips nodded under a faint breeze. "Poirot," Hastings said, pulling his coat more tightly around him, "I can't help feeling there's a queer atmosphere in that house this morning." Lady Amelia looked positively anxious, and Celia was as white as a sheet. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "You observe correctly, mon ami. There is tension, yes, and fear also. Fear that something may happen, or perhaps fear that something has already happened. We must keep the eyes open and the ears also. There is something concealed beneath this quiet English surface." When they returned to the house, they found a minor commotion in the hall. A footman was speaking in low, urgent tones to Lady Amelia, who looked alarmed. Gerald Fielding stood nearby, his hands in his pockets, his expression one of faint amusement. "It appears," Lady Amelia said after a moment, "that one of the maids heard footsteps in the corridor outside the cabinet room after midnight. She thought nothing of it at the time, assumed it was one of us going to fetch a book or something of that nature. But now she fears there was a prowler," Poirot suggested. "Exactly. I have already sent for the butler to examine the locks, but everything seems secure." "Nevertheless," Poirot said quietly, "it is good to know these things. May I see the cabinet room again before the photographer arrives?" Lady Amelia agreed at once, and together they went to the small oak-paneled room. The case stood upon its table, the necklace inside gleaming serenely. Poirot bent over it, peering through the glass. "Observe, Hastings," he said softly. "No dust upon the surface, no marks upon the lock. Yet I am not satisfied. The air of this room, it is different this morning, as though someone has disturbed it." Hastings sniffed, finding nothing unusual, but he had learned to trust Poirot's instincts. By 10 o'clock, the photographer had arrived, a nervous young man with a boxy camera and a tripod. The household assembled in the drawing-room, where Celia was persuaded to wear the necklace for the portrait. Hastings could not help noticing how reluctant she seemed to fasten it around her throat, and how quickly she removed it once the photograph had been taken. "Very becoming, my dear," Mrs. Linton remarked with a sly smile. "You will make some man very proud one day." Celia flushed and turned away, muttering something about returning the necklace to its case. Gerald Fielding moved to accompany her, but Lady Amelia stopped him with a raised hand. "No, Gerald, this is Celia's duty," she said firmly. "We must not take risks with the family treasure." For the rest of the morning, preparations for the evening's dinner went on as usual, yet Hastings could feel the tension mounting. In the servants' hall, he caught snatches of conversation, the housemaids whispering that it was unlucky to have a jewel of such value in the house, the butler assuring them that every lock had been double-checked. At luncheon, Poirot seemed unusually preoccupied, answering Hastings' remarks with little more than nods. He sat back with his fingertips pressed together, his eyes half closed. "You are thinking about last night," Hastings ventured at last. "I am thinking about many things, mon ami. The maid's story of footsteps, the nervousness of Lady Amelia, the agitation of Mademoiselle Celia, the attitude of Monsieur Fielding, who smiles too easily, And above all, the fact that such a necklace is a magnet that draws not only admiration but temptation. He looked up suddenly, his eyes very bright. "Mark me well, Hastings. If anything is to happen, it will happen soon, perhaps even tonight." Hastings felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at the polished cabinet, standing so innocently at the end of the corridor, and shivered despite the warmth of the fire. That evening, Highbury Hall was a picture of quiet country elegance. The lamps were lit early, for the mist had deepened into a thin, clinging fog that pressed against the windows and muffled every sound from the outside world. The household gathered once again for dinner, though there was a certain constraint in the air, as though each guest were privately preoccupied. Lady Amelia seemed anxious to keep conversation lively, asking the Colonel for tales of his time in India, encouraging Mrs. Linton's arch observations about the vicar's latest sermon. Celia spoke little, her eyes downcast as she toyed with her food. Gerald Fielding, on the other hand, was in excellent spirits, telling a series of amusing stories about life in London that made everyone laugh, though Poirot's eyes never left his face. When dinner was concluded, Lady Amelia suggested music in the drawing-room. Celia played a Chopin nocturne on the piano, her fingers lingering on the keys as if she found comfort in the melancholy notes. Hastings stood by the fire, content, yet acutely aware of the tension that hung in the room. It was like being in the last moments before a thunderstorm. One waited, holding one's breath, for the inevitable crash. At 10 o'clock, Lady Amelia rose and announced that it was time to secure the necklace for the night. The case had been brought to the drawing-room earlier at her request, and now Celia, pale but resolute, took the silver key from her reticule. Poirot stepped forward, bowing slightly. "Permit me, madame, to accompany you," he said. "One can never be too careful." Together they walked down the dimly lit corridor to the cabinet room, the footman following with a lamp. Hastings lingered near the doorway, watching. Celia unlocked the cabinet, placed the case inside, and turned the key. Poirot's eyes moved over every detail of the room, the curtains, the carpet, the heavy door with its polished brass keyhole. Satisfied, he nodded gravely. "Bon, now, mademoiselle, you will keep the key in your reticule as before, yes? And you will not, under any circumstances, part with it?" Celia nodded, though her hand trembled as she closed the clasp. An hour later, the household began to retire. Poirot wished Lady Amelia a good night with his customary bow and withdrew with Hastings to their adjoining rooms. Hastings, rather tired after the long day, was soon asleep. Somewhere distantly the grandfather clock struck midnight. Then a sound. It was very soft, but Poirot's ears were sharp. A creak on the floorboards just outside their door. Poirot rose, silent as a cat, and went to the door. Through the crack he saw a shadow move along the corridor, small and furtive. The detective slipped on his dressing gown and followed noiselessly. The figure, slender, cloaked in a dark robe, moved toward the cabinet room. Poirot watched from the shadow of the stair. The figure paused at the door, bent low, then straightened. There was a faint metallic sound, the unmistakable click of a key turning in a lock. Poirot held his breath. The door opened, just enough for the figure to slip inside. Minutes passed, then came a sudden muffled cry, very low, as if stifled, and the sharp snap of something metallic. Poirot darted forward, flung the door wide, and switched on the electric light. The cabinet stood open. The velvet case lay empty on the table. The cloaked figure turned, startled, and for a brief second Poirot saw a pale face, not Celia, not Lady Amelia's, but someone else entirely. Then the intruder pushed past him, vanishing into the corridor with astonishing speed. "Sacré tonnerre!" Poirot exclaimed, and Hastings, woken by the commotion, arrived just in time to see the fleeing shadow disappear around the corner of the landing. By the time the house was fully roused, Lady Amelia in her wrapper, Celia white as death, Colonel Fitzroy shouting orders, the necklace was gone. The intruder had vanished into the night as though the fog had swallowed them whole. The butler swore that all doors and windows had been fastened. No footprints were found on the gravel outside. It was, as Hastings later remarked, as though the thief had dissolved into the very air. Poirot, standing in the cabinet room, surveyed the scene with a face of grim satisfaction. "It has happened as I knew it would," he said softly. "But courage, mes amis. This is not magic, not the work of the devil. It is human cunning, and therefore it can be undone." He bent, examining the lock carefully. It had not been forced. There was a faint scratch, however, near the keyhole, the kind of mark left by someone working quickly, perhaps with a duplicate key. Poirot straightened, his eyes gleaming. "Now, Hastings," he said quietly, "the little gray cells must work their hardest. We have a thief to catch, and perhaps something even more serious to uncover." Morning at Highbury Hall dawned with a stillness so profound it was almost eerie. The mist of the previous night still clung to the lawns, turning the world into a gray, silent sea. Inside, the house was equally subdued. Servants moved about on tiptoe, faces anxious, as though speaking too loudly might summon the thief back into their midst. Poirot descended to breakfast later than usual, his expression grave but composed. Hastings, already at the table, looked haggard, having slept little after the drama of the night. Lady Amelia sat at the head of the table, her hands folded tightly, her face pale but resolute. Celia was beside her, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping. Colonel Fitzroy was uncharacteristically quiet, and Mrs. Linton sipped her coffee with a look of keen curiosity that suggested she was secretly enjoying the scandal. Gerald Fielding alone seemed unaffected, cheerfully buttering toast as though jewel thefts were everyday occurrences. Poirot took his seat with a slight inclination of the head. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said softly, "we will not dwell too long upon what has passed, but it is necessary that I should ask of each of you a little cooperation this morning. Will you grant me that?" Lady Amelia inclined her head. "Anything, Monsieur Poirot. We must have the necklace back at all costs. It is not merely valuable, it is part of our family history." "Then we shall begin at once," Poirot said. He asked that the entire household assemble in the small morning room. Hastings followed him, notebook in hand, for he knew from experience that Poirot's investigations moved with a precision that left no room for error. The first to be questioned was Celia. She sat very straight, her hands clasped in her lap, her voice low but steady. "I locked the cabinet myself last night," she said. "I placed the key in my reticule and kept it under my pillow. When I woke this morning, it was still there." "No one could have taken it while you slept?" Poirot asked gently. "I suppose, I cannot be certain," she admitted, her eyes wide. "But I am a light sleeper, Monsieur Poirot. I think I would have woken had anyone entered my room." Poirot nodded. "And tell me, mademoiselle, do you know of anyone who might have wished to steal the necklace?" She hesitated, then glanced involuntarily at Gerald Fielding before shaking her head quickly. "No, of course not." Poirot's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Next came Lady Amelia, who confirmed that she had risen once during the night to check the cabinet but had seen nothing amiss. "I thought I heard a noise," she confessed, "but when I looked into the corridor, all was silent." Colonel Fitzroy was blunt and brief. "Dashed bad business, this. Slept like a log myself, didn't hear a thing, but I'll wager some outsider managed to get in through a window. These country houses are devilishly hard to secure." Poirot merely inclined his head. "Perhaps, yet the windows show no sign of being forced." Mrs. Linton was next, her sharp eyes darting from Poirot to Lady Amelia as though eager to catch some reaction. "I slept badly," she said, "but I certainly heard nothing. What I cannot understand is how the thief got hold of the key. Unless," she broke off and smiled faintly. "No, I suppose that would be unkind." "Nevertheless, madame," Poirot said gently, "sometimes the unkind thoughts are the most useful. To whom did you refer?" "Only this, if I were a detective, I might wonder if dear Celia were quite so careful with the key as she claims." Celia flushed scarlet, but Poirot held up a hand to silence her. "Merci, madame, you are very helpful." Finally, Gerald Fielding sauntered in, cool and collected. "I'm afraid I can't assist you, Monsieur Poirot," he said with a lazy smile. "I went to bed shortly after 11, slept soundly, and woke to this delightful drama. I hope you will not think me unfeeling, Lady Amelia, but jewel thefts always strike me as rather romantic." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Romantic, perhaps, but also criminal, monsieur. Tell me, do you own a duplicate key to the cabinet?" Fielding laughed aloud. "Good Lord, no, I wouldn't know where to begin." When the questioning was over, Poirot requested that he and Hastings be left alone in the cabinet room. He spent nearly an hour there, on hands and knees, scrutinizing every inch of the floor and the lock with his little magnifying glass. Hastings, impatient, watched in silence until at last Poirot straightened, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "Well?" Hastings asked eagerly. Poirot smiled faintly. "There is something, yes. A thread of dark wool caught on the brass of the cabinet, and see here, the faintest smudge on the polished floor. It is as though someone stood very still here for some minutes before moving. Ah, mon ami, there is more to this affair than a simple theft." "You mean?" Poirot raised a finger. "Patience. We have only begun. There is the matter of opportunity, the matter of motive, and above all, the psychology. For mark this, Hastings, theft of so daring a nature is not committed lightly. There is passion here, perhaps even desperation." He walked to the window and stood looking out at the fog-bound garden. "This evening, we will gather everyone together once more. Before then, we must learn all that we can of their movements last night." Hastings felt the old thrill of excitement course through him. Whatever lay ahead, he knew Poirot was closing his net. The rest of the morning at Highbury Hall passed in a state of hushed expectation. Every sound seemed magnified, the clatter of the silver in the pantry, the distant creak of floorboards, the occasional bang of a door. The household had the air of a place under siege, as though each person awaited discovery or accusation. Poirot, undisturbed, worked steadily. With Hastings at his side, he began by speaking to the servants, one by one, in the butler's pantry. The butler, an elderly man named Judkins, was firm in his insistence that all doors and windows had been bolted before midnight. "I checked them myself, sir," he said, affronted. "Highbury Hall has never suffered a burglary, and it shall not begin while I am in charge." Poirot nodded gravely. "And you, Monsieur Judkins, you heard nothing in the night?" Judkins hesitated. "There was a sound, sir, about 12:30, a faint creak from the direction of the main corridor. I thought it was Miss Celia retiring late, she often does after reading, so I paid it no mind." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And which door did you hear open exactly?" "The cabinet room, sir," the butler replied reluctantly. "But as I say, I assumed it was one of the family." Poirot made a small, satisfied sound in his throat and moved on. The housemaids reported nothing unusual save for one. Mary, a timid girl with anxious blue eyes, confessed that she had seen a shadow crossing the landing around the same time. "It was tall, sir," she whispered. "Too tall to be Miss Celia, if you take my meaning." "And what did you do?" Poirot asked. "I ran straight back to bed and put the covers over my head," Mary said, flushing. "I was frightened." Bien, that was perhaps wise. After the interviews, Poirot returned once more to the cabinet room. Hastings watched as his friend moved about silently, stooping now and again, or pausing to inspect the edges of the carpet. "Poirot, I don't see what you hope to find," Hastings said at last. Poirot smiled indulgently. "Because, mon ami, you look with the eyes but you do not see. Regard this carpet. Here, near the corner of the cabinet, the pile is crushed. Someone stood here for some time, motionless, perhaps listening." Hastings bent to look, still baffled. "But it could have been anyone during the day." "Non, this carpet is brushed daily. Those marks are of last night, and look here on the brass keyhole, a faint trace of wax. Someone tested a duplicate key, Hastings. It did not turn easily, and they used wax to take the impression." Hastings whistled. "Then it was an inside job." Poirot raised an elegant finger. "Perhaps, or perhaps a very clever thief who has been in this house before, studying the ways of the family. The psychology, Hastings. It is there we will find our answer." In the afternoon, Poirot requested to examine the guests' belongings. Lady Amelia hesitated but finally agreed, her face drawn. The guests submitted with varying degrees of willingness. Colonel Fitzroy grumbled but handed over his valise. Mrs. Linton pretended to be amused, though her eyes were sharp. Gerald Fielding shrugged as though it were a joke at his expense. It was during this search that Poirot found the first tangible clue. In the pocket of Colonel Fitzroy's dinner jacket lay a small sliver of blue thread, not wool this time, but silk, the exact shade of Celia's evening gown from the night before. Poirot examined it carefully, then returned it to his envelope without comment. "Do you think the Colonel is involved?" Hastings whispered as they left the room. Poirot shook his head slowly. "It is a piece of the puzzle, yes, but beware the obvious. Sometimes the clue that shouts the loudest is merely there to mislead." By tea-time, the entire house was simmering with tension. Mrs. Linton could barely conceal her excitement. "Have you found the culprit yet, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked archly. Poirot smiled his most enigmatic smile. "Perhaps, madame, or perhaps I have only found that which points me to the true culprit. Tonight, I will ask that you all gather once again in the drawing-room. Then, perhaps, we shall begin to see more clearly." After tea, Poirot walked alone in the misty garden, his patent leather shoes leaving neat prints in the gravel. Hastings joined him after a time, shivering in the damp air. "Poirot, you're as mysterious as a stage conjurer," Hastings said. "You've collected scraps of wool and silk, a smudge on the floor, and a maid's frightened testimony, but we're no closer to finding the necklace." "Mais non, Hastings," Poirot said softly. "We are very close indeed. The thief believes he is safe. Tonight we shall see whether he still believes it when I have finished with my questions." He turned to look back at the great house, its windows glowing softly in the mist. "There is a very human story hidden within these walls. It is not merely a theft, Hastings. It is a drama of the heart. You will see." Evening descended early over Highbury Hall. The fog had thickened into a pale wall outside the windows, so that the house seemed suspended in its own lonely world. Lamps were lit in the drawing-room, and a fire burned brightly, throwing dancing shadows upon the polished floor. The household gathered reluctantly at Poirot's request. Lady Amelia sat stiffly on the sofa, her hands clasped in her lap, the picture of strained dignity. Celia perched beside her, pale as a ghost but with an air of resolve. Colonel Fitzroy stood by the mantelpiece, his expression grim. Mrs. Linton took a chair near the fire, her sharp eyes glittering with barely concealed anticipation, as though she relished the prospect of scandal. Gerald Fielding leaned nonchalantly against the piano, his smile as careless as ever, though Hastings thought it did not quite reach his eyes. Poirot stood near the center table, his hands folded, his head slightly inclined as he surveyed them all. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "the time has come to bring this unhappy business to its conclusion. The necklace has been stolen, yes, but thanks to the exercise of the little gray cells, I know now who has taken it." A ripple of movement passed through the group. Celia caught her mother's hand, Colonel Fitzroy scowled, and Mrs. Linton leaned forward like a cat ready to pounce. Poirot held up a finger. "Before I name the culprit, allow me to set out the facts, so that you may all see the path by which I arrived at the truth." He paced slowly, his patent leather shoes glinting in the firelight. "First, we have the question of access. The cabinet was locked, and the key was in the possession of Mademoiselle Celia. It is true that the key might have been taken while she slept, but there is no sign of her room having been entered. Therefore, it is likely that a duplicate key was made. The faint trace of wax upon the keyhole tells me this." Colonel Fitzroy shifted uneasily. Poirot's eyes turned toward him. "And who might have had the opportunity to take such an impression? Any of you who handled the necklace on the first evening when it was passed from hand to hand. That gave our thief both motive and means." He turned, his gaze falling upon Gerald Fielding. "Monsieur Fielding, you admired the necklace for longer than anyone. You spoke of its beauty, its magic. You held it in your hands, turning it in the light. And it was you who had the easiest opportunity to take an impression of the key while Celia's back was turned." Gerald straightened, his smile tightening. "That's a serious accusation, Monsieur Poirot. I hope you have more than a theory." "Mais oui," Poirot said softly. "There is also the matter of the wool thread caught upon the cabinet. At first I thought it pointed to Colonel Fitzroy. His dinner jacket is of similar cloth. But then I found a second clue, the smudge on the floor where someone stood very still. The person who took the necklace was slim, quick, and left almost no trace. The colonel, I think, would have been less quiet." He turned suddenly to Celia. "Mademoiselle, you know, do you not?" Celia's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered. "I knew last night when I saw the corridor empty and heard the door click." "Gerald," her voice broke. Lady Amelia gasped. "Celia." Fielding's face darkened. "Very clever, Poirot," he said bitterly. "Yes, I took it. And why not? The necklace was to be sold, displayed to strangers, turned into a public curiosity. Celia should have had it, not some dusty museum." Poirot shook his head gently. "But you did not take it for her, monsieur. You took it for yourself. You are in debt, gambling debts, I think. The necklace would have paid them handsomely." Fielding's shoulders sagged. "You leave me no choice but to confess," he said at last. "I meant no harm to Celia. I only meant to spirit it away long enough to raise the money I needed." Lady Amelia rose, her face stern but sorrowful. "You have betrayed our hospitality, Gerald. The police must be informed." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "I think that will not be necessary, madame. The necklace has already been recovered. It was hidden in the secret compartment of Mr. Fielding's suitcase, a clever place, but not quite clever enough." Fielding said nothing. Celia covered her face with her hands. Poirot's voice softened. "It is a tragedy, yes, but better that it should end thus, with the return of the necklace and no violence done." The drawing room was very still after Poirot's announcement, as though the entire house had exhaled at once. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the hush that followed Gerald Fielding's confession. Lady Amelia stood with great dignity, her eyes fixed upon the man who had once been a welcome guest. "You will leave Highbury Hall tomorrow morning," she said quietly. "I shall not have the police called if Monsieur Poirot believes it unnecessary, but you are never to set foot here again." Fielding bowed his head. "I understand," he said hoarsely. "You have been more than generous." He turned to Celia. "I am sorry," he added, and for a brief moment his careless charm was gone, replaced by something almost genuine. Then he left the room without another word. Celia, very pale, stood silently by the piano. Poirot approached her with a gentleness that was almost paternal. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "you have been brave tonight. To love unwisely is not a crime, but to remain silent when the truth must be spoken, that is a tragedy. You have prevented that tragedy." Celia's eyes brimmed with tears. "I did love him," she whispered, "but I could not bear to think of our family name being dishonored." Lady Amelia gathered her daughter into her arms. "You have done what is right, Celia. Your father would be proud of you." Colonel Fitzroy cleared his throat gruffly, perhaps to hide his emotion. "Dash it all, Poirot," he said. "You've handled this business with a delicacy I wouldn't have credited. I thought you'd have Scotland Yard down upon us before breakfast." Poirot smiled, twirling his moustache. "Sometimes, Colonel, the law must be tempered with understanding. Monsieur Fielding is a foolish man, not a wicked one. I think he will not trouble you again." Mrs. Linton, who had been silent for the first time all day, gave a little laugh that sounded almost regretful. "Well, Amelia, you must admit it will give the village something to talk about for weeks to come." "Let them talk," Lady Amelia replied firmly. "The important thing is that the necklace is safe." The following morning dawned bright, as if to wash away the troubles of the night before. The necklace, restored to its case, seemed to gleam with a purer light when Lady Amelia showed it to Poirot before breakfast. "I can never thank you enough, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "You have spared us all a great deal of pain." Poirot bowed. "It was my pleasure, madame. The truth, it is like the sun after rain, it clears away the mists." Later, as Hastings and Poirot walked down the gravel drive to meet the waiting car, Hastings gave a low whistle. "Another case neatly tied up, Poirot," he said, "though I must confess I rather liked Fielding. He had dash, you know." Poirot looked thoughtful. "He is a man who chose the wrong path, mon ami, but perhaps now he will choose differently. As for Mademoiselle Celia, her heart is bruised, yes, but it will mend. And Lady Amelia will sleep more soundly knowing the necklace is safe once more." Hastings glanced back at the house, glowing golden in the morning light. "Funny, isn't it? For all the drama of last night, it looks as peaceful as ever." "Ah, Hastings," Poirot said, smiling. "The surface may be calm, but beneath there are always the little currents, the passions, the jealousies. That is life, and it is for us, for you and for me, to watch, to observe, and sometimes to intervene, n'est-ce pas?" Hastings laughed. "You and your little gray cells. Well, here's to the next case." Poirot gave a satisfied nod. "Indeed, mon ami, the next case it will come as surely as the dawn." With that they stepped into the waiting car, and the great house of Highbury Hall receded behind them, once again serene, its secrets laid bare and its jewel restored.